Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us for this CLE course on New York's Grieving Families Act. This course was actually presented as a portion of a program entitled Proving and Improving New York's Wrongful Death Damages. That course was presented by the Academy in January of 2022. If you received credit for that course already, unfortunately, you cannot also receive credit for this course today. This is just a half credit course focused purely on the Grieving Families Act portion of that program. I'm going to introduce our speaker for today's course, Christina Sonsire. Christina is a partner at the Ziff law firm located in Elmira, New York. She represents plaintiffs in personal injury, medical malpractice, and wrongful death cases. She was an undergraduate soccer star at Georgetown University and is a graduate of the University of Montana's Law School. She is a member of the exclusive multi-million-dollar Advocates Forum, a super lawyer, and a national best law firm from U.S. News. Here at the Academy, she is our vice president for the 3rd Judicial Department and a member of our Judicial Screening Committee for New York State Court of Appeals candidates. Thank you so much, Christina, for taking us through New York's Grieving Families Act.
It is, without question, one of the most important topics for anyone who's practicing law in New York State right now. I think a lot of us, when we think about the Academy, we think about all of the great CLE content, but there's also another arm of the Academy, and that is advocacy for civil justice, not just on the plaintiff side or to the defense side, but really identifying places where New York law needs to change. I've been involved with the Academy for about 14 years, and this topic, that being the woefully inadequate wrongful death law, has been front and center, within the top couple of advocacy items throughout that time, and it really precedes that. It goes back a long time. This is the moment right now where there's a potential for change. And, this, hold on a second. So this first slide really drives home what we're talking about. And again, Joe and Chris did such a good job of illustrating what it is we're talking about when we're talking about wrongful death. So the clients that come to see you, with small exceptions, maybe for a spouse who now is suddenly a single spouse raising children, or God forbid, children who've lost both parents, or a spouse who is very dependent on the other for money. The clients are not coming to see you for financial reasons. They're coming in for justice, right? Really for 3 reasons. One is their grief, right? They're overwhelmed with grief. They've just had the most horrific thing imaginable happen, particularly in the loss of a child. So they're coming in, they're grieving. Number 2 is they want justice. I mean, how often do you hear that? I'm not here for money. We want justice. And people will say that in all sincerity. They've come to a lawyer, maybe for the first time in their lives, because they need justice for this person that they loved. And number 3 is the deterrent effect. And their clients won't say that I'm here to deter, but what they want is something to happen, because with the exception of criminal situations, maybe you have a wrongful death by DWI, there's going to be a criminal aspect of the case. Many times, this is the only way that people can get justice for what has happened to their loved one. So if you, with this image, that's what it's about. That's what wrongful death cases are ultimately about. There's going to be a document provided to all of you called Wrongful Death in Action by one of the Academy members, Martha Piggott. Highly recommend that you give it a read. It is excellent and really lays out the background for the case. The paper starts with this quote, and it drives it home, right? Think about our language. There's a word for a wife who loses her husband. That's a widower. A widow. A husband becomes a widower. A child becomes an orphan. But in the case of a parent who loses a child, one of the most horrific things anyone can imagine, there's no word for it. And in New York, there's no recovery for it. All right, 1847. So if we think back 1847, I actually did Google this. Polk was the president, right? We had 29 states at that time. The Civil War was more than a decade away. The Industrial Revolution was well underway. That's the year that New York State's current wrongful death statute passed. And by way of just a bit of history, under the English common law, there was no right of recovery at all for wrongful death. There were rights of recovery for personal injury, but in a wrongful death context, there was no right for recovery and no way to recover for the loss. However, in England, during the Industrial Revolution, there were a number of deaths on the railroad and in construction and in the building process. And there was a movement to rectify this. So in 1846, there was a law passed in England that for the first time under the English common law recognized a right of recovery for wrongful death. Interestingly and ironically, the next year, 1847, New York became the very first state to allow recovery for wrongful death. And that right, however, was very, very nuanced. Allowing for pecuniary injuries only. So that financial loss that Joe and Chris were talking about. And if you think about it at the time, who were the people that were working? White men. So there was no right of recovery for the wrongful death of a woman, of a child, of someone who was not white and not in the workforce. And in fact, at that time, under both the English law and at the beginning under the New York law, there was an offset for consumption. So for children, for instance, there was even an indebtedness toward a person who would have caused a death. Since that time, since 1847, all states in the United States have passed wrongful death statutes, but only 8 others have failed to update it. New York, for as progressive of a state as it is in many, many ways, is by far one of the least progressives when it comes to wrongful death. The statute has not changed since 1847. There has been a movement to rectify this problem for decades. And right now, as we'll talk about, it's the closest that we have come to finally changing the law in New York. All right, so briefly, to kind of reiterate what Joe and Chris spoke about, there are a number of ways that a wrongful death creates damages. One is the first one for the decedent's life itself. And that's kind of what Chris talked about. What is a life worth ultimately? What is your child's life worth? What is your spouse's life worth? And that encompasses everything that it means to be alive. The second aspect involved with wrongful death is that of grief. And again, that is when people think about wrongful death, it's that pain, the suffering that a survivor suffers when a death occurs. The third, pecuniary loss, certainly is important. Again, especially when you're talking about the death of someone who provided monetary support to the family. In with pecuniary loss is what Joe spent a lot of time on. That's the loss of guidance and nurture, and also the loss of household services. So there's no question that is an important part of wrongful death. It's just not the only part. The fourth is essentially the loss of consortium, right? So the loss of that relationship, which is compensable in a personal injury action for spouses, but that relationship that's broken, which also involves a parent to a child. When a child dies, that relationship is broken, that society is gone. And finally, the direct financial costs that are associated with a death. Typically, you're talking about funeral costs and medical expenses. So what do we have in New York? New York only recognizes number 3, the pecuniary loss, and number 5, those direct losses from the death itself. Nothing for grief, nothing for that loss of society. And I'll tell you this, if you've been doing this for any time at all, and if you haven't had this scenario come up, you will, where you have people come into your office. Let's say it's the loss of a child. You are going to be burdened with explaining New York's law to them, telling them that their child's loss is essentially meaningless in New York Maybe there's an aspect of conscious pain and suffering, but if not, that loss is almost meaningless. I had an example the other day of a case that we actually litigated for several years, and ultimately were able to settle it, not for much money. And it involved a child who the pregnancy had gone well. Everything was okay in delivery until there was a massive delay in delivery, and the child was born massively brain injured. Had that child survived, there would have been a large recovery for the family for all of the child's medical needs. Tragically, the child only survived for 2 days, and the loss was very minimal. And I'll tell you, even with that case, we explained to the client early on why we were taking it, to see if there was a way to kind of push the bounds. But even today, recently, after having these discussions many times, parents still not understanding, but she died and she didn't have to. And that's really what this entire movement is about. All right, so who is disadvantaged? Really, if you think about it, it's the folks who are not bringing money into a household. And this is where, frankly, the law as it stands is incredibly discriminatory. So elderly decedents, particularly if they are not working or if they don't have a surviving spouse or dependent children, young adults, those that have no dependents and are unmarried. They could be in a long-term relationship perhaps, but no spouse, no dependents, unmarried, widowed, childless adults, anyone who's unemployed, not bringing money into a household, stay-at-home moms and dads who are in the household but don't have that income coming in, children, as we've talked about, and then people of color and women. And that's because we have to ask ourselves who are typically the highest earners in our state, and it continues to be white men. So the law discriminates against all those who are not within that category. All right, so some of the unjust results. This first one I just briefly discussed, but the law perpetuates these discriminatory outcomes based on income disparity. So the more you make, the more that your family members, your distributees, can recover. The second we've talked about a lot by now is that it places almost no value on the life of a child. And for the parents looking for some way to get justice for the loss are then hit twice. They are hit in the first instance by the horrific event, the negligence, the recklessness, what have you, that caused the death of the child. And in the second instance, being told that, yes, your child died of negligence. Yes, this was avoidable. But no, there is no way to recover. And no, there is nothing you can do to get justice against the person who has done this. Third is now with the choice of law, where in mass events, many times the choice of law is based on the residency of the victim. Absurd outcomes occur across the country because many states, in fact, most states, all but 8 states, have far more progressive statutes when it comes to wrongful death, but we don't have that in New York. So you can have the same type of death, maybe it was a plane crash, and have wildly different results because of where a person lives. And finally, you have another absurd type of outcome, which is that a defendant actually does better if a person dies than if a person is injured and survives. And that in many courts across the country that have interpreted their statutes have pointed to this, that makes no sense. All right, so the Grieving Families Act. This is an act that is currently pending. Well, it's currently being considered within the New York State Legislature. Last year, passed through committees in both the Assembly and the Senate, but never came up for a vote in either chamber. This year, it is back in committees. It's in the Judiciary Committee in the Senate, and it is in the Codes Committee in the Assembly. There is tremendous sponsorship and support for the act. In all likelihood, if the Grieving Families Act, which I'll discuss in just a moment, were to come for a vote, it would pass. You never can predict what a governor is going to do, but certainly there is hope that Governor Hochul would support the act as well. All right, so what does it do? First of all, it rectifies the wrong, which excludes grief and anguish from the recovery that a person can achieve in wrongful death. So it adds grief and anguish caused by the loss of love, society, protection, comfort, companionship, and consortium. Finally, that very, very relevant aspect of wrongful death would be part of New York's compensation. It leaves the pecuniary injuries unchanged, as it should. Again, pecuniary injuries are a very important aspect of wrongful death. They're not just the only one. Second is that it would make a change from only distributees being able to recover to surviving close family members. And again, as Chris pointed to the zone of danger case, we're seeing an expansion as to who can recover as society continues to change. Certainly as the litigant, you'd have to prove these relationships, but it would open up the recovery to those who are not strictly distributees. It would include non-economically dependent parents, adult children, grandparents, domestic partners, step-parents, siblings, and close family members, as it should. And again, the proof would have to come in the way that Chris was describing so well, painting that picture for the jury, but it allows an expansion to really stay up to date with where society is today. And the third very important aspect is that it would update the statute of limitations. So currently in an injury action, the statute of limitations is 3 years. This would change the wrongful death statute, which is currently 2 years, to 3.5 years. 3 years to mimic personal injury, and then an extra 6 months because of all of the legwork that has to happen through surrogate's court in order to bring an action. Okay. The next are 3 horrific cases. Most of you probably know of these, and they really drive home just how inadequate the law is in New York State. All right, the first one, the Schoharie limousine case. Horrific. 20 people died. The limo owner, the company owner, was prosecuted and last fall struck a plea deal that avoided any jail time. So as we've discussed during this aspect, that element of finding justice just isn't there for these families. Their only way that they're going to be able to find justice and really find answers about what happened is through the civil justice system. But this next slide shows just how unfair and unjust it is. So it's unthinkable, really, to consider the King family lost 4 daughters that day and 2 son-in-laws. And it's a great example of how the law discriminates based on a person's lot in life. So daughter Amy, married, okay, the spouse would have a right of recovery. The spouse died as well. No children. Where are the wrongful death losses for her? Allie, not married and no children. Abby, age 35, married. Husband also died with 2 daughters. And Mary, her husband also died and she had a son. So with Mary and Abby, they have children who will have rights of recovery for pecuniary loss, presumably, right? Kind of depends on Mary and Abby, were they working, were their fathers working, but presumably the children would have pecuniary loss, would have loss of guidance and nurture. For Allie and Amy, they don't have those aspects. All right, the Quag Uber crash. Also a horrific event. And let's look here at just how different the rights of recovery are. So for Ryan Keiss, age 25, all right, in a relationship for 6 years, but not married, no children. Michael and James Farrell, not married, no children. And for the Uber driver, Faran Zahid, married, has a spouse, and has 3 children, right? So the pecuniary loss for Zahid is going to be much different than it is for the other 3. And again, this is what the Grieving Families Act is seeking to rectify. And finally, we had entitled this Boy Scout crash, but changed it to homicide. This is just one of the most tragic and horrific instances and glaring examples of how wrong our law is. This case involved a young boy, Andrew McMorris, had gotten up that morning, gone to church with his family, and his mom dropped him and his dad off for a hike with the Boy Scouts. They were out having a great day. At the same time, a man by the name of Tom Murphy decided to go to a golf course early in the morning, 9 a.m., and began drinking heavily. I believe played 6 rounds of golf, drinking throughout the day, was slurring his words by the end. There was testimony that one of his friends, at least one of his friends, advised that he not drive, but he got behind the wheel anyway and plowed right into this Boy Scout troop. Andrew McMorris lived for a short period of time without consciousness. And think about, under our law, as we've described today, where is the justice under the civil justice system in New York for this family, for the most unspeakable tragedy? So right now is a moment for all of us. Again, this is not a plaintiff side issue or a defense side issue. It's a civil justice issue. If you have an opportunity to take action, this is the time. The legislators in Albany need to hear from us. They need to know that this issue matters and that we need to have a change. So if you have the opportunity, please reach out to your legislators, reach out to your clients. Think back to those families that you had to tell, had to explain New York wrongful death to. Reach out to your colleagues, anyone you can, to let Albany know that this is the time to act. The votes are there. We just have to get this act up for a vote. And there's a very good chance that New York will finally rectify what has been a very unjust situation for 175 years now.
Thank you so much, Christina. That was amazing. I so appreciate you taking us through all of these very important details and sadly horrific stories. Hopefully we can really do something about this law. I want to welcome a special guest to join us now. I want to welcome Kurt Keese. Kurt's son was just mentioned in Christina's stories. Unfortunately, he passed away, and Kurt sadly learned firsthand how limited New York's wrongful death law is at bringing justice. So I just want to give Kurt a couple minutes to give us his perspective as a parent of a child who was negligently killed. Kurt?
Okay, so I just joined this webinar a few minutes ago, and I listened to Christina go over my tragic story with my son. And just for the record, last name's Keese, not Keis, but it's okay. Everybody does that. And how I learned about all this. So my son was a victim in this car accident, taking an Uber out to go dancing in the Hamptons, like so many young adults do. And my attorney, who I think is participating as today, Jim Kiley, right away told me about New York State's crazy law. And I thought that it's just archaic. How could this be in such a plaintiff state? I'm only an accountant, but I know that it didn't seem fair if somebody wrongfully dies and it's only based on what income they're making or who's dependent on them. It just seemed not right. So amongst that and road safety, I've taken those two things up as issues, and I've started a process. I've talked with the McMorris family, who I've met with the McMorris family, and in that case, clearly negligence was proved, but there was still no real damages for their loss. The gentleman sits in jail. I know they were offered small amounts of money. It's tragic. So what I've done with my attorney's help and another young attorney who just passed the bar, I've started to organize my thoughts. I have a worksheet put together I shared with Michelle of all the states and how they stand on this issue. In New York, with 8 other states, there is still this crazy old-fashioned law. We're aligned with Alabama. If you want to be aligned with Alabama, if you're from Alabama, I don't mean to offend you, but generally speaking, I don't think we want to be aligned with Alabama. So I've also had put together a more formal legal memo and on this, comparing New York to other states. And I've been sitting with state senators and assembly people, and I'm pushing in, and I contacted this association after seeing the email you sent around about getting support. I'm now speaking at another community event for a young lady that was killed on December 13th in a car accident in Elmira. And I'm spreading this word. And I think that when people hear this story, they're shocked that that's the New York State law. And the truth is, no one knows when they're the victim. When my son left my house that night, I didn't know what was going to happen. So, sorry, it's not a Republican thing. It's not a Democrat thing. It could happen to anybody. And it's just something that more people need to know about. And as far as where it dies in Albany, that's just some lobbyist getting his way with somebody to bury it, and that shouldn't be. I do think now what happened last week with this fire in the Bronx is a perfect example. And I emailed the Bronx borough president today about this. I would like to speak to that Bronx borough president about these damages for these families and all these children and all these low income earning people, that their damages are ridiculous in New York. So I think this is an excellent opportunity. This fire in the Bronx, very tragic. The governor's there, the borough president's there, the mayor's there. Everybody needs to push in on this and contact these people and say, hey, let's get this done. And that's where I stand on this. I'm just an accountant trying to act like a lawyer. And I've probably been doing that way too much my entire life. But this is just seems wrong. It's also, I think it was pointed out, it's very discriminatory, meaning that a person who makes little income gets little representation, really. Who's going to defend somebody with a small claim versus a big claim? It just seems really not right in today's world. So that's where I stand. I think that it's all, Michelle, it's all about awareness. When people hear it, it's outrageous to think that that could be your child. Yeah. I have a newspaper, Newsday is writing an article, and the headline I want is, what is your child worth? What is your child worth? Is your child worth 0 to you? And I was asked by an attorney representing a defendant, what did I expect from my adult child for economic support in the future? And which is a ridiculous question. He asked me that Christmas week. And my answer was, the only thing I expected from my son was for him to buy me Father's Day dinner, okay? Nobody expects their child to support them economically. I had an adult child who was moving his way up as an accountant. I hope my child never supported me that way, but I do have a great loss.
Indeed. Thank you so much, Kurt, for joining us and being with us today. Before we wrap up, I just want to encourage everyone to take a moment to go to hopefornewyorkfamilies.com, send a message to your elected officials and tell them how important it is that we make the Grieving Families Act a priority, that it's brought up for a vote, and that it's passed into law this year. Thank you all so much for being with us today. Bye.